This week on Eye for Iran, I'm joined by Eyre, the State Department's first Persian language spokesperson under President Obama. He's now a distinguished diplomatic fellow at the Middle East Institute. He spoke directly to Iranians in Farsi while Washington tried to negotiate its way out of a nuclear crisis. We'll look back at those years, the hopes, the hard choices, and the lessons learned. If the U.S. had stayed in the JCPOA, would it have worked? Did Obama get more right than people give him credit for? And what about President Biden? Was there a real chance to bring the deal back after Trump pulled out, or was that window already closed? Now Iran faces what some Islamic Republic officials call an existential threat if Britain, Germany, and France reimpose UN sanctions. The U.S.-Israel campaign has weakened Iran's regional influence and struck at its nuclear program. Is this ironically the outcome Obama wanted all along?
That to me would be the main difference, is that we're really not paying any attention to the Iran portfolio. We've sort of outsourced it to Israel.
And we'll end on a lighter note. Alan's love for Persian poetry, his favorite moments speaking directly to Iranians, and a few behind-the-scenes stories from his time in office.
مرغی دیدم نشسته بر باره توس در پیش نهاده کله کیکاووس.
I'm Nagar Moshehedi, and this is Eye for Iran. Eyre, welcome to Eye for Iran. It's an honor to have you here.
Honor to be here.
How are you doing today?
Another lazy day in heaven here in Vienna, Virginia. All good.
Wonderful to hear. Before we begin with the legacy of the JCPOA and your role at the State Department and negotiations, and also your love of the Farsi language and Persian poetry, which is a topic all on its own, I thought we could begin with looking at Washington's approach to Tehran right now. What's the biggest difference in terms of how Washington deals with Iran, in terms of their approach, and how you dealt with Iran when you were at the table?
I would say the biggest difference between now and when we were doing JCPOA is just the amount of importance, the amount of attention that Washington is giving the Iran portfolio. During the Obama administration, when we were doing JCPOA, that was a foreign policy priority, and the Obama administration was willing to break a lot of glass in terms of other secondary priorities to get it done. From everything I can tell now, the Trump administration doesn't really see it as a priority, especially after the 12-day war between Israel and Iran, where we helped bomb Iranian nuclear sites. After that, President Trump said the nuclear program's obliterated. They seem to have put it in the mission accomplished category. And so as far as I can tell, it's not really a priority, especially given the case that the gentleman in charge, Mr. Witkoff, has a lot of other stuff on his plate, to include Gaza and Ukraine. So that to me would be the main difference, is that we're really not paying any attention to the Iran portfolio. We've sort of outsourced it to Israel.
Elaborate on that in terms of, well, how do you feel, like, what are the next steps then if this is not a priority? Are there going to be next steps, or is it, like you said, mission accomplished? There still is 400 kilograms of, unaccounted for uranium that's missing.
No, I'm not saying I see it as mission accomplished. I'm just saying, from what I can tell, that seems to be the Trump administration's assessment. What's next? What's next is for Israel. I mean, it's a ceasefire. We can tell from what Iran has been doing that they see the war is still ongoing. They've recreated this Supreme Defense Council. They're trying to figure out how to reestablish some type of strategic deterrence. They're rounding up all the usual suspects, given Mossad's deep penetration that allowed these strikes to be so successful. So for Iran, it's a ceasefire, and they fully expect a resumption of hostilities, as does Israel. Israel has said they'll go back in, I think mowing the lawn or mowing the grass. If it sees Iran trying to reconstitute its air defense, if it sees Iran trying to reconstitute its nuclear program, or its missile production capabilities. So I fully expect Israel to attack again at some point in the future.
So basically, you see, like you said, Trump has essentially, in your view, outsourced the Iran file to Israel and let it be however they choose to do it. And that's the approach now, the foreign policy, American foreign policy on Iran.
I think for the time being, it's certainly not an exigent priority. I mean, we've also got the possibility of snapback of the UN sanctions. Iran has been signaling a lot that it wants to resume negotiations with the U.S. As far as I can tell, and I have to stress, I don't have access to the U.S. negotiating team. I have no access to classified information. So all I can see is sort of based on what I read in the press, both Persian and English, and just my best sense based on 40 years of experience. So it seems that Iran is eager to get back to the table with the U.S., even though I don't think it really trusts the diplomatic process that much. It's also trying to negotiate with the Europeans, the E3, so there could be a postponement of snapback that gives them more time. But as I said, for the U.S. right now, President Trump said after the strikes, we may negotiate, we may not. We've achieved what we wanted to achieve. The nuclear program's obliterated. As you point out, it's not obliterated. It's certainly a lot of the infrastructure has been destroyed, but the key component of Iran's nuclear program, which is its knowledge, still exists, even though that also has been vitiated by the Israeli assassination of many of the top nuclear scientists. So the question becomes, is Iran deciding that based on these recent events, it actually needs to push toward a nuclear weapon? It seems to be the case that Israel's strike was not precipitated by its perception that Iran was close to being nuclear. It had been planning this for a while, and for a variety of reasons, it was a propitious time to do this, so it struck. So one of the key questions now is, does this strike make Iran more likely to decide, oh, the hell with it, we need a nuclear weapon?
And do they have the capability or the ability to do so at this point?
Sure they do. I mean, it's a question of how long it takes. They have an industrial infrastructure. They either have the requisite centrifuges or they can rebuild them. They have some enriched uranium. I mean, again, they've got 60, if they have, and it's unclear to me, but, you could build a type of nuclear weapon with 60% enriched uranium, or you can enrich it up to 90%, which isn't that hard. So will it happen in the next year or so? No, I don't think so. I think as a short-term issue, which is the event horizon that pretty much every politician tends to focus on, it's not a problem. Iran is much weaker than it used to be. It's lost its proxy network. Its air defense has been destroyed. Its missiles are depleted. And its nuclear program, a lot of it is smoking rubble. So for the short term, Iran is much less of a threat than it was a year ago or 5 years ago, right? Question is, on a longer term, post the end of a Trump presidency, is Iran more of a problem? Because now it's like, goodness, the deterrent we had didn't work. It's going to be tough to reconstitute. It's an open question whether they can rebuild Hezbollah back to its previous strength. As we know, they've lost Syria. Iraq is open. So, a year ago, everyone was saying how wonderfully clever Iran was with its three pillars of its strategic triad. All those pillars are gone now. So Iran is everyone's always saying Iran is at a fork in the road. The fork in the road now is, does it try to reconstitute what it had before? Or does it try something else? And does it try to get a nuclear weapon?
So how do you view the 12-day? Yeah. I was going to say, how do you view...
They're debating now.
Of course. And how do you then, I guess, view the 12-day war and U.S. involvement? It seems like, as you said, short term, potentially kind of dealt with the issue, but in the long term, has it made Iran more dangerous?
Too early to tell. I mean, it depends between what happens, now and then. It depends on whether the U.S. can actually do a deal with Iran that's similar or better than the JCPOA. I mean, we know that Iran is willing to accept limitations on its nuclear program, but it is not willing, even after this 12-day war, which was so ruinous to Iran, to give up what it sees as its right to enrich on Iranian soil. And again, let it not be left unsaid, there is no real strategic reason for Iran to have this much emphasis on its nuclear program. Nuclear energy provides about 1% of Iran's, energy production. It's lost billions and billions in terms of sanctions, in terms of being an outcast in much of the world. It's suffered mightily for its nuclear program. So one asks oneself, why is Iran insisting on maintaining the right to enrich? Because it wants the capability to surge to a nuclear weapon, and also because if the history of the Islamic Republic of Iran has taught Iran anything, it is that you cannot depend on any external power for anything. This was a lesson that was created during the Iran-Iraq War, where Iran saw itself as alone. It's a lesson that's been reinforced by a history of sanctions, such that Ayatollah Khamenei now insists on this chimerical goal of khod kafai, self-sufficiency, which is economically not viable in this day and age. But he does this because in his mind, and he's the one who has largely created the strategic framework in which Iran operates, in his mind, to the extent that you're dependent on other powers, that's like bearing your throat to the wolf.
Everyone keeps saying, like you just mentioned, 2024, 2025, the theme seems to be Iran is weak. In our last episode of Eye for Iran, we had from the Trump administration, first Trump administration under Iran envoy Brian Hook, Len Khodorkovsky, and he was talking, Iran is at its weakest point right now and basically at its tipping point. And, we keep hearing that, but at the same time, on the surface, it appears that the Iranian government is still, together and as repressive as it's ever been. So how do you view that when people say, well, Iran is weak? I ask myself, well, what does that mean for Iran and the people of Iran? Sure, regionally, they've been weakened. Sure, they're nuclear file, as you said, on temporarily speaking. But what about as a whole? Is the U.S. kind of underestimating this whole Iran is at its tipping point?
I think you're right. I think, weakness is it's a simile. It's a metaphor, as if Iran is a physical body. Yes, Iran is weak in the sense that it cannot project power beyond its borders or defend its borders as well as it could before. But let's not assume that there's any type of correlation between that and regime fragility. If you look at the Middle East, you see many near-failed states that are economically not really producing for their people, and you don't see regime change. Regime change is very, very rare. Look at the Shah's time. Iran was doing relatively well back then for many metrics. Still, there was a revolution. So, yeah, Iran is weak in many ways, but I've seen no evidence that this has resulted in a tipping point where there'll be, regime change. Because, secondly, there's nothing waiting in the wings to replace this regime. Regime change is a constant process. This regime has already changed in that it's lost a lot of its key military leaders. And this experience has changed it. I think it's become far more nationalistic as time goes by, far more militaristic. It really is not an Islamic republic in many ways. Islam is the language that Iran uses, much like, communism was the language that the USSR used to extend its power.
They're even serving alcohol now in some places, believe it or not.
I listen to Khamenei's speeches all the time. I'm sure you do too.
Yes.
And I'm always struck on how totally not grounded in any type of reality they are. These increasingly threadbare languages with his rhetoric that has no relation to any sort of reality. It's the same lexicon, the same vocabulary that he inherited from Ayatollah Khomeini, for whom, and he's worked in some nationalist threads because I think he and the people advising him realize that nationalism is a much stronger card than the sort of pan-Islamic, rhetoric that Khomeini famously preferred when he actually was trying to extend the Islamic Revolution, throughout the region. I think Iran has largely the same foreign policy now that it has under the Shah, which is it wants to be a regional hegemon. It's just that the means by which they're doing it and the rhetoric they use is vastly different.
And what about the people of Iran? In a country of 90 million people, where obviously we don't have reliable polling, and like you mentioned, there's no organizational muscle on the ground in Iran in terms of opposition in that sense. How do we know what the people of Iran want in terms of their future and how U.S. foreign policy can help shape Iran going forward? Because, I spoke to Professor Thomas Janal of the University of Ottawa a few weeks ago, and he kind of distinguished it between three categories. He said you've got, a large bulk of the Iranian population that we know is against their own government, but they're not willing to go out onto the streets. They value their safety and their security first. But of course, like anybody else, they want human dignity and respect and a good life. They want a normal life like anybody else, right? And then you've got another kind of small percentage, maybe 20% that are willing to go out on the streets, who are willing to go and revolt. And then you've got maybe 10 to 15% that are regime loyalists, etc. How do we know what Iranians want and going forward what to do to produce policy without that reliable polling and given the state that Iran is in right now?
Well, first of all, I defy you, and you can defy me, to make any statement about any nationality where you say the Iranian people want X, the Canadian people want Y, the Swedish people want Z, right? You can't. So, again, I see lots of people saying the Iranian people want X. And that's probably true for a lot of Iranian people. What do people as a whole want? I don't know to the extent they still use Maslow's needs hierarchy, but the things you mentioned are pretty high on the needs hierarchy. Freedom of expression, political rights,
human dignity, basic human dignity.
I think far more basic than that, Iran is becoming, and this to me is the most interesting thing going on in Iran right now. It's not the nuclear issue or any of the other stuff. It's the fact that Iran is increasingly unable to provide the basic needs for its people. In terms of electricity, in terms of food, in terms of water, right? So,
it's very sad.
Is nice.
It's very sad.
Water is even nicer, right?
Of course.
So this, to me, is the key dynamic of Iran going forward, where you've got a government that's made its selection primarily on ideological fealty to the regime as opposed to competence. It's like a longitudinal study over time. And as Iran's population gets bigger, there's more corruption. Climate change is making a huge difference. It's getting hotter. There's been a drought for 5 years. So it's getting harder and harder to provide for the basic needs of a lot of the Iranian people, right? Up until now, if you look at protests in Iran, women, life and freedom, the Green movement, most of them have been for political reasons. But it seems to me that due to these endemic chronic insufficiencies that Iran is suffering from, they're going to be more and more hard-pressed just to provide food, provide water, provide electricity. That's going to get tougher.
So then what does that mean then for the people of Iran and how the government reacts and their future, and then in terms of how the U.S. will shape their own foreign policy?
I don't think the U.S., again, when you work in the government, you get a profound sense of how little, not how little the U.S. can do, but how little it is to, in a nuanced way, affect another country. Now, the U.S. has got an almost $1 trillion military. We can bomb stuff. We can blow stuff up. We can do sanctions, and we've done all of that. We've been doing sanctions for decades on Iran. And now, for the first time, we've participated in kinetic action in Iran. We'll see if that continues going forward under the Trump or whatever administration comes next. But I don't think the U.S. can play a shaping role in the future of Iran. First of all, why should it? It's got other priorities, right? Iran is important to the United States to the extent that it's a security threat to the U.S. national interest, either the U.S. itself or the U.S. regional allies, okay? So obviously we monitor that. To this extent, I won't say rapprochement, but at least the increased conversation between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran is interesting, because to the extent that Iran can work out bilaterally and regionally its relations with its Persian Gulf neighbors, that obviates the need for U.S. involvement. And this is one of the reasons why Iran's relations with its neighbors in the region is such a priority for this Ministry of Foreign Affairs under Araghchi, because they realize its vital importance. I mean, what does Iran want? It wants the U.S. out of the region, okay? It wants to be a regional hegemon. It can't do that with the Fifth Fleet parked in the Persian Gulf.
So what is this?
Well, anyway, just to round off your question,
Yeah.
I mean, Iran is always, the U.S. is always focused on the Middle East because it provides so much oil, and to an extent, oil is fungible. So we don't necessarily need to get it ourselves, but we need it to sort of input to the market. But I don't think the U.S. has, even if this administration wanted to, which it surely doesn't, has the ability to, in a nuanced, constructive way, help shape Iran's future. They have a good saying in Persian. They say, "Kes nechorad pushte man, joz nechone angoshte man." No one scratches my back other than the nail on my finger. So, the Iranian people will be determinative in shaping their future, both inside the country and outside.
And how do you, where do you see that going then? I'm still wondering what this means for where Iran is headed with, like you said, water shortages, electricity shortages, it's the situation, the economic collapse.
It's going to be tougher. It's going to be harder. And one of the interesting things about
but harder for what?
For Iranians. I mean, it's a bleaker future, more likely. I mean, for example, when the revolution happened, Iran's median age, I think, was 18 or 19, right? Now it's around 36. Iran post-revolution had one of the most successful population control programs, so much so that this current government, and recently they want to increase the birth rate because it's fallen below, the total fertility rate is below reproduction.
Well, and people aren't getting married, so
getting married, and those parts of the population that Iran worries about the most, the minorities.
Love how you threw in a yanni.
Have a higher total fertility rate. Baluchis are having more babies, Kurds, Turks, pick Arabs, whereas the Persians are not. And again, for some reason, I think the government finds this troubling. Probably because historically...
Ethno-religious lines, yeah.
Yeah, for the minorities. So, and all things being equal, an 18-year-old urban male unemployed is a lot likely to cause more problems than a 36-year-old urban male or a female with a spouse and family and a job. So that's one of the reasons why I think, Iran is less likely to agitate successfully. It's an older population.
So I'm just going to play you a clip here of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, speaking of Iran's water shortages, and then let's listen in and we'll get you to react after.
The moment your country is free, Israel's top water experts will flood into every Iranian city, bringing cutting-edge technology and know-how. We will help Iran recycle water. We'll help Iran desalinate water.
So, Alan, your reaction to that, your thoughts?
I mean, he's factually correct. Israel has the technological prowess in relation to water to be of immeasurable help to Iran. My last job before I retired, I was political counselor at the U.S. Embassy in Jordan. And there was extensive conversations between Jordan and Israel, and also water sharing. So yeah, Israel is on the leading edge in the region on water technology. Now, the larger point is also obvious, which is that Israel is trying to create, if not regime change, at least significant regime degradation. One of its goals in the 12-day war was to encourage popular insurrection.
Which didn't work.
Well, yeah, but it's not over yet. It's a ceasefire. So this tape by Prime Minister Netanyahu is just another effort along that axis. It wants the Iranian people to rise up and get rid of this government, because it seems in that way Iran would be less of an existential threat to Israel. So, when Israel went into Iran, it had, short-term goals, most of which it achieved, but it also had longer-term goals, which is to destabilize the government, right? And, so that's, his comments about water, I see as another attempt by Prime Minister Netanyahu to get the Iranian people to act against its own government.
And
he's right. Iran has done a lousy job providing water to its own people. With the whole guns or butter dichotomy, the Iranian government has said, we'll go with guns, in terms of, sending money abroad, supporting its proxy network, giving money to Yemen, to wherever, as opposed to try to eliminate the corruption within its own system and provide the basic needs to its own people. I mean, if you look at, and I'm sure you've seen this, you track the economy of Iran and Turkey since the revolution, because they're analogous in terms of size and population. Turkey is like this, and Iran is, it has economic performance since the revolution, despite having, one of the largest reservoirs of oil and gas, has been horrible.
And how do you feel that the government of Iran would receive something like that, and the people? Because, there have been critics. The irony is not lost that Netanyahu is talking about water when Israel is facing accusations under his leadership of withholding clean drinking water to Gazans. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of how it's actually being received? And also, anecdotally, we're hearing that the 12-day war, that a lot of Iranians who may have supported Israel are now kind of flipping because they felt that Israel didn't back them up when it came to the 12-day war, and didn't really take action in terms of supporting Iranian people. So that a lot of Iranians we're hearing who are anecdotally just hearing this, who are in support of Israel, are now not so much inside the country.
Well, I think, again, what has to differentiate between the diaspora and Iranians inside Iran?
I'm talking about inside Iran.
Okay. Again, it's tough to make generalizations about what the Iranian people think. I think a lot of Iranians were upset over the fact that Israel bombed Iran, that it destroyed buildings, it killed people, it bombed Evin prison, for God's sake. So doubtless there are people in Iran who oppose the government, who wish that Israel would have done more to get rid of the Iranian government. But I think there were as many, if not more, whose sense of nationalism was inflamed by the fact that Israel attacked Iran. I can remember following Iran back in the early 80s, where, the stories were rampant of pilots in the Shah's government in prison trying to get out of jail to fly sorties against Iraq when Iraq had invaded Iran in the Iran-Iraq War. So I think one of at least the short-term consequences of Israel's attack on Iran was an increase in nationalism. Now, I don't think that necessarily extends to, in the longer term, more support for the Iranian government, because the same problems still remain, right? But I think that at least I can't assume that Israel is more popular in Iran now than it was before the attack. I think in many ways it confirmed a lot of people.
That's what I'm saying. It's the opposite now. It's not
like yeah. I think Israel is far. But you're saying they're less popular because they didn't get rid of the regime. I'm saying they're less popular, probably more likely.
Of course,
because,
I see what
they
you're saying.
Attacked Iran.
Of course,
As for and the fact is, globally, Israel is far less popular because of what many people are calling its genocide against the Gazan people. Now, genocide is a legal term, but they are obviously exercising collective punishment against the Palestinian people in Gaza and also the West Bank for October 7th, right? Which was a horrible terrorist attack. No one is defending what Hamas did, but it seems to be an empirical fact that globally Israel is far less popular than it used to be because of its actions relative to Gaza.
Like you said, nationalism for the people of Iran, not for the government of Iran, right? You know, and a lot of Iranians we spoke to inside Iran said we're stuck between a war and a repressive regime. Like, what do we do?
Exactly.
We're being hit from both sides.
Yeah. No, definitely. I think, but again, it's, what are the alternatives? In the sense that I agree with you. Again, there is no polling, or at least polling.
Reliable polling, yeah.
There's not a lot of unclassified polling. I remember seeing some when I was in the government, but obviously the regime in Iran is very unpopular, right? For a variety of reasons. Yeah. Everything from high prices to, putting people in jail for, bad hijab to, and a raft of other related reasons. So I'm not saying that this regime is going to remain more popular because of the Israeli attack. At the end of the day, they are still facing the same basic inability to provide essential goods and services to its population in an effective manner.
Yeah, but and going back to my earlier point, there were some small percentage of Iranians who actually believed in Netanyahu's messaging when he said that he would support the people of Iran. A lot of them really did, and thought that somehow he would magically come in and overthrow their government. I'm not saying that's a big sector of Iranian population, but there were some people we talked to who did think that, and who are now kind of like, oh, wait a minute. How are we going to do anything? And we're supposed to do something for ourselves. And they felt very abandoned and starting to see things in a different light. To my earlier point.
Well, I would say, again, it seems to me that Prime Minister Netanyahu would be eager to help an Iran that is run by a government that is compatible with and friendly with Israel. I take that as a given. The question is, how likely is that to happen?
And now I wanted to pivot into the JCPOA and the legacy and your role. So a friend of mine actually texted me an interview that Obama did in 2015 with PBS, and it was fascinating to watch in hindsight and where we're at right now and what we know. So I'm just going to play you a clip of that, and then we can talk about it right after.
This is what I'm driving at, though. As you know very well, Mr. President, your critics have argued that this deal, even whatever it does to the nuclear program, leaves Iran free to act in the region in ways the United States may well oppose.
Yeah, but
that's their argument.
But Steve, that is not accurate, because the notion that somehow Iran is untethered ignores the fact that, for example, we'll still have our sanctions in place with respect to non-nuclear activities like sponsorship of terrorism or violation of human rights. There will still be UN prohibitions on arming groups like Hezbollah. And so there's no evidence, there's no logic to the notion that somehow we will let up on trying to prevent activities that Iran may engage in that would be contrary to our national security.
So what are your thoughts, Alan, looking back and being part of the JCPOA, your reaction looking back now?
If his basic thesis is it is easier to solve one tough bilateral issue than two, that seems not that controversial. So when we did the JCPOA, it was to take the threat of Iran building a nuclear weapon off the table, right? And people go, well, why didn't you do missiles? Why didn't you do human rights? Why didn't you, whatever, pick a problem? It's the same reason that when you do surgery, you don't do thoracic surgery, leg surgery, eye surgery. It's a tough thing. And all things being equal, it's harder to achieve two goals than one. So the fact that we focused exclusively on putting Iran's nuclear program under serious constraints doesn't mean that the other issues weren't important. It just meant that we wanted to do this first. And one of the nice things about the JCPOA, if President Trump hadn't pulled out, is that it laid the groundwork for future conversations, because it showed that diplomacy could work. It created channels of communication, direct communication, between Iranian leaders and U.S. leaders, which had never happened before. Okay? So while it is not the case that talking solves everything, it is the case you can't solve anything without talking. So JCPOA, in addition to putting Iran's nuclear program in a box, set the stage for possible other future conversations about other contentious issues. But again, that went sideways.
And after I watched that, or rewatched that interview, because I did watch the original in 2015, and this is well before I knew I was going to interview you, I made like a little chart just for fun. It was quite interesting, where I took what Obama had said in that interview versus like what actually ended up happening looking at the present. And when it comes to breakout time, for example, the JCPOA would have extended Iran's breakout time from months to about a year, which it did. And, even if you look at think tanks from very conservative to more centrist to left-leaning, even the FDD, the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, which is obviously more of a conservative think tank, acknowledged that Iran's enrichment to 60% installation, advanced centrifuge, stockpiling of uranium beyond the JCPOA caps happened after the U.S. Trump's withdrawal in 2018, and that Iran was actually abiding during that period of time before the U.S. Pulled out. And now when it comes to regional behavior, et cetera, if you look at the Middle East Institute where you're at and the Washington Institute, it did say that the lifting of the sanctions did allow Iran to fund. But like you said, that was a separate issue on its own in terms of Iran's regional aggression. And then when it comes to the sunset clause and expiration dates, I guess that's all obsolete now after the U.S. withdrawal,
Well, that's a sunset
right?
clause.
Yeah.
Yeah, because that's an exigent concern because it's happening in mid-October.
Exactly. Yeah. So, and what about now the E3? Because something about the JCPOA that you had in place was the snapback resolution 2231 of the United Nations, which you just talked about right now. Iran is now saying, some Iranian officials are saying, well, if the Europeans enact this, the A3, this is an existential threat. Do you feel that Iran will capitulate, or that they're going to try and salvage some sort of deal? And again, now that the U.S. has pulled out of the JCPOA, they don't have this snapback mechanism, but it is within the hands of the Europeans. So what do you make of that?
I think Iran is focused on getting an extension so that UN sanctions don't snap back in mid-October. Because if nothing happens, then the sanctions go away. Iran is treated, at least by the UN, as a normal country in the context of the NPT. And it's clearly the case that the E3 doesn't want that to happen. The US doesn't want to happen. So the only way of preventing that is, well, there's two ways. One is to snap back the sanctions before they expire in mid-October. And the other is to extend the deadline. Now, again, the E3, again, this is one of the differences between the JCPOA. During the JCPOA, we were in lockstep with the Europeans and with the Russians and with the Chinese. It was the P5+1.
International unity, right? Yeah.
Yeah. And this is, one of the key characteristics of the negotiation process was the close cooperation between the U.S. and, for example, Russia. I mean, cooperation between the U.S. and the E3, was expected back then. But even with Russia, we were very close coordination regarding the Iranian nuclear threat. That's no longer the case now, and it's no longer the case now, as far as I can tell, that we have any real effective coordination with the Europeans on the Iranian nuclear threat. We see it as a bilateral issue. So the E3, who, as you say, are still within the constraints of the JCPOA, are saying to the Iranians, you need to show some progress in terms of negotiations, or we will snap back. And obviously, Iran is keenly averse to the Europeans invoking snapback, so they're talking to the Europeans. Now, how high the Europeans are setting the bar, it sounds pretty low, at least from recent statements. It sounds like if the Iranians agree to cooperate with the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, then maybe the Europeans will push back the deadline just to give more breathing room, because there's not a lot of time here. I mean, again, the JCPOA, I did it from the beginning for the first 3 years where it was ineffective. of 2010 to 2013. Ahmadinejad was president. Jalili was in charge of the nuclear portfolio. Iran had no real interest in reaching a solution. Then Rouhani became president, and they decided they needed to improve the economy, which Ahmadinejad had driven over a cliff, by getting rid of sanctions, which meant nuclear negotiations. So the 2 years from 2013 to 2015 were very effective, and eventually we got the JCPOA. But right now, there is no multilateral effort. As I said, I don't see any cooperation between Mr. Witkoff and the Europeans. I'm sure there's conversations, but I don't think there's deep cooperation. So what the Europeans are doing is at least trying to get Iran to move in the right direction.
And you said the Europeans are setting their bar kind of low, but given but given, like you said, that the Iranians have an incentive to want to come to a deal, couldn't the Europeans then use this to bring in other factors, like, for example, human rights, try and change Iran's behavior if they can in the short term, or even when it comes to transnational repression on their own soil coming from the Islamic Republic in the West?
I don't think so, because, again, one of the key factors of the 12-Day War is it didn't shift Iranian red lines. Again, the strategic vision that Ayatollah Khamenei operates under, which is if you retreat under pressure, that's like chum in the water. The sharks circle even closer. If you show weakness by retreating, they look at what happened with the USSR, with Libya, with Saddam Hussein. If you show weakness to the West, at least this is the Khameneist vision, they just want more, right? So, the E3 could say, we will snap back unless you, drastically improve human rights, stop your missile production, stop enrichment on Iranian soil, and whatever else. But then Iran will just say no, because even though they certainly don't want sanctions to snap back, it seems to me at least they're unwilling to cave in on their red lines to prevent that from happening. Iran is, what's that saying? Beating these in bod belarze. It's not the willow that trembles with the wind. It's been sanctioned since 1979, right? So, it's.
So they can survive this, is what you're saying,
Yeah,
even with this
right.
economic collapse and water shortages, etc.
It seems the snapback of sanctions preferable to capitulating on its red lines and signaling to all its enemies that it's weak and ready for further aggressions.
Now, one question I like to ask American officials, especially who worked under President Obama, who had an opportunity to have those one-on-one interactions with Iranian officials, is what are your views on Islamic Republic officials? Do you see them as pragmatic and transactional, or are they more ideological, or can we not put, paint a brush on all of them, one brush or something? How did you view them in general, if you can speak in general terms?
Again, like generalizations about Iranians, Saeed Jalili was ideological, right? The team under Zarif, Arakchi, the others, they certainly believe in the ideology, but they're transactional. They're good diplomats in the sense that they carry out their instructions. People like Arakchi, people like me, people like, our negotiators, they're tubes. They're executors of policy that's decided at higher levels, right? So, one of the most impressive display of diplomacy I've seen was from the head of our negotiating team, Wendy Sherman, over the 3 or 4 years she did it. Because not only was she negotiating with Iran, she was negotiating with the P5+1. She was talking to Israel. She was talking to the Gulf countries. She was negotiating, or at least talking with, the Treasury Department, which had its own agenda, the NSC. It was obviously taking orders from the White House. So it was a massive coordination effort. That's not happening now because Mr. Witkoff has one person he's getting input from. That's the president, right? There's pretty much one person in the foreign affairs who he's coordinating with, and that's Prime Minister Netanyahu. So for the U.S. now, it's a vastly simpler process. There's no real, as far as I can tell, expertise being called on within the State Department. It's a very lean operation. So that's what's different now, or one of the things that's different now.
Yeah, that's something you going back to kind of the beginning of our conversation that, like you meant, you felt that the Trump administration this is not a priority for them, and this is shown in this lack of coordination, or that going back to that, if you could elaborate, or does that mean, like you said, that they've kind of given this file to Israel in a sense?
It's not a priority in the sense that they think they did what needed to be done, right? But
actually, or what they're projecting, or do they actually believe that themselves? Like that is an important distinction, eh?
I think it's a very transactional government. I think they perceive that it's no longer a problem for their administration, right? That they've destroyed Iran's nuclear infrastructure, and even if
they didn't necessarily. So why?
Even if they didn't, Israel is watching and will clean up afterwards. Israel will mow the lawn as needed going forward. And again, if President Trump has said, if we need to bomb again, we'll bomb again. So I'm not saying that President Trump has decided that he will no longer involve himself in the Iran portfolio. What I'm saying is it seems to be the case that he pretty much likes where U.S. policy is on Iran right now, right? Successful military strike. Israel is watching. We'll see what happens. And he's got other fish to fry. He's going to Alaska to be with Putin. He's got Ukraine. He tends to involve himself with a lot of stuff and then sort of go for a quick fix and move on. So he went for a quick fix. He's calling it a victory, and they're moving on. Now, Israel, which I think has a far more nuanced and realistic view, because they're in the neighborhood, and for them, Iran is an existential threat, unlike the United States, they're paying close attention. And if Israel feels that further U.S. attention, kinetic action is needed, I'm sure Prime Minister Netanyahu will reach out and make his concerns known to the U.S. government.
Now, what about President Biden? I don't know. Do you have any insider knowledge? Did they ever get close to reviving the JCPOA?
I know that President Biden and his team were trying to do a JCPOA plus during the Biden administration. But again, it wasn't a priority. I mean, there's,
And why?
Because he had other priorities. You can't make everything a priority. There's what Obama did that no other president did is say, I'm going to make, and I've said this a couple times, Iran what's called an independent variable. I'm going to focus on that, and Israel policy will be a dependent variable. It's Iran will drive the train. What I'm trying to do with Iran will drive the train. It will irritate Israel. It will irritate the U.S. Congress. It will irritate the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia. I'm willing to break that glass to get the issue of a nuclear weapon in Iran off the table for the time being. So that's what he did. No other president had done that, to include President Biden. President Biden got into office and he had other priorities. He had, Gaza. He had Ukraine. So he was not willing to say, once again, I'm putting Iran at the top of the pile and everything else will be secondary to that, because he had other priorities. People always say, I can walk and chew gum at the same time. Well, the U.S. government can walk and chew gum at the same time, but it cannot, historically, been able to take on a multitude of foreign policy priorities and solve them all simultaneously. It has to focus.
And when it comes to Trump pulling out of the JCPOA in 2018, and then also the Biden administration, like you said, it wasn't a priority for various reasons. Why are we at where we're at today? Could that also be because the Biden administration didn't have it as a priority? And if they had secured a deal, we wouldn't be where we're at? Is that a potential, or looking back, no?
I wouldn't blame exclusively. It takes two to tango, So, while it wasn't a priority, we were talking to the Iranians. Now, don't forget, it's like Charlie Brown and the football with Lucy, JCPOA had happened. I can remember doing interviews as the Persian language spokesperson where Iranian news people would ask me, what if the next administration pulls out? And I laughingly replied, as long as Iran is keeping, its end of the agreement, why would any U.S. administration pull out?
Well, there you go. Be careful.
Right. So there you go, So again, two things happened after JCPOA that were significant strategically for Iran. One, Trump pulled out for, as far as Iran was concerned, no good reason, right? And two, to an extent, the tsunami of economic benefit that many people were expecting didn't happen as much as Iran wanted to happen. It didn't solve all of Iran's economic problems. It couldn't have. There was no massive Western investment in Iran that lifted all boats, okay? So during the Biden administration, I think to an extent the Iranians were still whipsawed from what had happened and what had not happened, right? So maybe they were less eager at that time to pursue a deal. Hard to say.
Yeah, of course. And are there any lessons then to be learned from the JCPOA that can be applied to the now?
Yeah, talk. Diplomacy is a necessary but not sufficient condition to solving problems between nations. You cannot solve anything in a long-term way kinetically. The U.S. government has a massive military. It's really good. Israel has a very good military. Okay? In the short term, Iran, as a result, especially due to Israel's incredible performance during the 12-day war, Iran is no longer, in the short term, a problem for either of those countries, at least in the manner it was before. Okay? Now, the question is, will Iran become more of a problem mid to long term as a result of the Israeli attack and U.S. involvement? Don't know. There's a famous biologist, I forget his full name, who said with complex systems, you can't do just one thing. Okay? So Israel and the U.S. destroyed much of the Iranian nuclear infrastructure. That was one thing. The follow-on consequences of that in terms of Iranian thinking, in terms of the fact that, right now, the Iranian economy is horrible, right? It's going to have to spend a lot of money it doesn't have if it chooses to reconstitute strategic deterrence, right? We've got blackouts, and 3 or 4 days a week. You've got water shortages. You've got temperatures in southern Iran that are literally unbearable, okay? You've got, the expulsion for no real reason, as far as I can tell, of tens of thousands of Afghans. So Iran has serious structural, endemic, chronic problems that comes from decades of both external pressure and internal incompetence and corruption. Instead of dealing with those problems, it now has to go, well, wait a sec, do we try to reconstitute Hezbollah? We saw Ali Larijani's recent visit to Lebanon. Do we try to...
They're still trying, right? They're still trying.
Yeah. Do we try to improve our air defense, which has been gutted by the Israelis? So Iran has serious problems, but it is likely, especially given the primacy of the IRGC, which is an institution, survived quite well during the war, even though it lost much of its leadership, right?
It's remarkable when you think about it.
Well, it's again
how they survived.
The IRGC, ever since the end of the Iran-Iraq War, when President Rafsanjani started throwing construction money at it, has become, as you know as well as I, this massive economic / security / military behemoth.
It's everything.
Yeah, that does, not everything, but it's anywhere there's money, there tends to be IRGC. So, and it is, this is why I don't think the Islamic Republic is a theocracy. I think it's largely a police state these days run by the IRGC. And, to be flippant, the day that the IRGC makes more money by being Israel's friend and America's friend, you could well see a shift. But right now, the IRGC is doing quite well, thank you, from the enmity of the West and of Israel.
On a personal level, as a former negotiator, how do you feel right now in terms of the state of affairs in Iran? Some supporters of Trump might say, look, they've curbed Iran's nuclear ambitions, at least in the short term, and dealt with the regional proxies. This is what you wanted out of the JCPOA. What would you say to that? How are you feeling on a personal level? I'm curious.
Well, I mean, again, I've been, trying to learn the language. I've love the culture, love the poetry, love the literature for, 40 plus years. I have tons of Persian friends, Iranian friends. So it pains me to see the Iranian people suffering so much from their government, right? In this, they are not alone. Just because we're talking about Iran, if you look at much, if not most, of the Middle East, many of these are countries where the population is suffering mightily from incompetent and corrupt governance. And that's not even exclusive to the Middle East. Another topic for another day, but this is becoming more and more of a problem. So, I don't see Iran at this point as a vital threat to the United States. I think you take a step backwards. What to me is much more of a threat is, as I said, the fact that already in the Middle East, the average temperature has gone up by 2 degrees Celsius. 18 of the 21 countries, I think, are water stressed. So I think, William Gibson said, the future arrives unequally. The future has already arrived in the Middle East in terms of climate change. And instead of the nations of you talk about Netanyahu offering help to Iran, you're going to need that. You're going to need all the countries of the region to work together against the common enemy that is a worsening climate and more inhospitable conditions. And that's not happening, right? And that's not even a conversation that's happening in the capitals of the MENA countries. So, and again, the U.S. doesn't seem to be paying a lot of attention to the Middle East these days. President Trump is quite keen on relations with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain. The other countries, not so much. So, I don't think the U.S. sees the Middle East right now as a priority.
And thank you for your empathy when it comes to the Iranian people. That's very important and lost on a lot of diplomats. They don't consider that when they're thinking about other geopolitical factors, etc. So thank you for that. And I wanted to end things on a lighter note. And if you could tell us about anything memorable that stands out to you during your time at the State Department dealing with the Iranians, your love for Persian poetry and the language, and how you got into and all of that. I'd love to hear that from you.
Well, again, I was very lucky. I mean, I didn't start learning Persian as a job move. I just liked the language and I loved the poetry. Then I wound up at the State Department, and because at that point I spoke Persian pretty well and knew a lot about Iran, I got to be involved in very historic negotiations. But what was nice was being able to talk to Iranians in Persian. Learning new phrases, new expressions, new poems.
And that's my fondest memory of you, watching you on Persian TV.
Yeah, I mean, I can remember in 2001, I was one of the first diplomats to go back when we reopened our embassy in Kabul, Afghanistan, because I spoke, Dari and Farsi are so close. I got to go and help reopen the political section. And I remember how much fun it was then speaking the language, right? So, and then, I worked in Dubai at the consulate there following Iran. And so I just loved being in a job for a long period of time where sort of work and interest intersected so much and where it mattered. So that was fantastic for me.
And so when did your love of Persian poetry and culture and art and the language then begin, if it wasn't a job thing?
I was interested. Back when I was sort of in the college era. I was an English major and I was into, mysticism and Sufi stuff. And then I was out in Los Angeles and had a lot of Iranian friends and just started picking it up. So it was sort of just, it was coincidental. And it's funny because, as I said, it just worked out nicely because at the one time where, it is not always the case. There's a great saying, the greater the crisis, the less the expertise is brought to bear on it. Because if it's a really big crisis, you've got people way up in the food chain making decisions. even they don't know a lot about it. Where I was so lucky was there was a crisis, or at least an important issue, and the people running the thing said it would be nice to have someone who knows a lot about Iran and who speaks the language. So, on the nuclear negotiating team, I was the Iran subject matter expert and also the one who was interfacing with Persian media. So, I don't know a lot about sanctions. I don't know a lot about nuclear. We had people on the delegation who were great at that. And so everyone sort of worked together. It was a very harmonious experience. Good friends, among all the people. And it's like I said, Wendy Sherman was just amazing, as was Bill Burns and the others. It wasn't just her, obviously. But yeah, it was fun to work on an issue I cared about, to be able to, to practice my Persian and learn. I still, if I hear a phrase or something or a poem, I'll write it down.
Oh, that's lovely.
Even though I don't need it anymore, but it's just fun to learn.
Of course. And is there a Persian poem that you could pick that would describe the state of Iran right now and the world that we're in?
A Persian poem.
Any of your favorites that could kind of summarize what you're feeling right now?
I'll tell you, I'll read what I just wrote down. I don't know if it summarizes it, but I just wrote it down. And
Please do. Yeah, I'd love to hear it.
Hey, you ready for this?
Oh, yeah.
مرغی دیدم نشسته بر باره توس در پیش نهاده کله کیکاووس با کله همی گفت که افسوس افسوس کو بانگ جرس ها و کجا ناله کوس. The things I like about Persian poetry, you have this whole sort of carpe diem, seize the day thing, like drink wine while you can. You have this whole fatalist thing like that, like it's all going to turn to dust. And then you have, like with Saadi, you have, it's almost like his, it's just instruction manual, how to live life, how to see things like wisdom. And then you have, Rumi, which is, this mystical, So, whatever your desire is, metaphysically, you can find a Persian poet who's going to scratch that itch.
And if there's one thing, I know we talked a lot today, and I really enjoyed our conversation. It was very enlightening. Thank you. If there's one thing that you want the audience to take away from today, that you want them to know, what would that be? Just
that, these days with the State Department has been gutted. It's not really able to do its job. It's not being asked to do its job. The importance of diplomacy, because as I said before, even though just talking to other countries doesn't mean you're going to get a solution. The fact when Wendy Sherman or Bill Burns was talking to Mohammad Javad Zarif, that didn't guarantee there'd be a solution, but there has to be discussion. There has to be understanding. Bombing something doesn't require understanding. It doesn't require empathy. It doesn't require communication. But sitting across a table and saying, okay, here are our problems. How are we going to do this? Here's a text. What can we agree on? It's an essential part of finding a solution. It's not happening these days. And I guess the final point I'll say is that the U.S. does not have a magic wand. People go to the U.S., it's the world's superpower. It's got this, it's got that. Yeah, we're in many ways the preeminent, historically and for the time being, the preeminent world power. Still, one of the things I was struck by when I was in government was how little that gets you in terms of your ability to influence events. So,
wow.
Iranians who are outside their country have a very clear view of the type of Iran they would like. I have a very clear view of the type of Iran I would like. The problem is that can't be imposed just by the United States. We saw that with Iraq, okay? So it's just a sense of the limitations of power. And once you realize those limitations, you realize you just need to put people in a room and just start listening and talking. Not just talking, but just communicating. Might not work, but it's our best chance.
Yeah, and I wanted to add to that. We had Richard Nephew, who also worked on the JCPOA a few weeks ago on Eye for Iran. And and of course you guys know each other very well. And I had asked him, there was all these social media posts and critics saying, if Trump, and this is before the 12-day war, of course, and Trump was, the Americans were talking to the Iranians, and you're rewarding them for this, blah, 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 blah. And there was a lot of criticism online. And then Richard just, he shook his head and he goes, no, negotiations, talking is not a form of reward. This is how you deal with national security interests. It's the first step. It's what you're supposed to do. And please don't ever see talking as some sort of, reward here. It's not a reward. It's quite the opposite.
2 points. First, there was an Israeli prime minister, former, who said, you don't negotiate with your friends, okay? You negotiate with your enemies, okay? So it's silly.
There'd be no need for negotiation if it was
exactly.
Right? There you
Secondly, yeah, Richard Nephew, as someone who's watched him perform throughout his career, this guy is an expert on nuclear, on sanctions, on Iran. He was like the Cal Ripken of nuclear negotiations. He could do it all. So if Iran, my respect for the people on the team was massive, to include him, who was just indispensable.
And to close off, I know I told you that was the last question, but I still have more questions. Sorry. Do you have any memory that stands out to you from your time working on that Iran file or during the negotiation period? Anything that you'd like to share with us that really, that you still talk about to this day with your friends and family?
I don't talk with my friends and family about it, but the thing I liked best.
Why not?
Well, because I got three.
It's interesting. It's interesting. You need new friends. You need new friends. You can't get a new family, but
what I remember is just that, like I said, we had a great team, negotiating team, and so just when we were sitting around talking with each other, exchanging information, asking questions, or relaxing after an incredibly long day. The camaraderie was just tremendous. So I miss the friendships. And also I miss, to be honest, being in a high pressure situation where your performance mattered. I was someone who spent a lot of time trying to be good at X. And to be in a situation where it mattered if you were good at X, that was good, because otherwise you're just like a scalpel that's sharp, that's never been used, right? So the freakish timing of being called on to help, where my skill set was needed, and whether it mattered if I did a good job or a bad job, it's like playing professional sports. You're just in the zone where the level of performance is within your reach, but only if you concentrate and make sure you do a good job. So that's what I enjoyed.
Well, thank you so much, Alan, for joining us today on Eye for Iran. I had a lot of fun.
So did I. Thank you so much. They were good questions. I hope I answered them well.
You did. You did an excellent job. You can sign up for our weekly briefing newsletter at iranintl.com/newsletter. We deliver what you need to know with top stories, key analysis, and exclusive reports direct to your inbox. The Eye for Iran podcast series is brought to you by Iran International, your go-to destination for expert Iranian news in both Farsi and English. For more, you can head to our dedicated English website, iranintl.com/en.